Hey, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Populist Patriot. Y'all thought I forgot about you? Nope, I haven't. Just been busy with all sorts of good things, work, physical fitness, my daughter, girlfriend, paddleboarding, exercise, etc. Working on some major articles for an upcoming Substack subscription newsletter. Um, That'll be coming out soon. But with me, after this contentious November election, and it looks like we all survived somehow or another, we have Charles Daniels. Charles Daniels is a recurring guest, one of my favorite guests, probably my favorite guest when it comes to domestic policies. Charles is the founder of Americans Workers First. He is also an official in Ohio for the Communication Workers of America, which is a major national private sector union. And Charles and I, we're going to be talking about the purpose and the mission of American Workers First, and then we're going to bleed into a discussion about the midterm elections, the future of American labor, what the Democrats and the Republicans did right, what they did wrong, and I'm sure a whole bunch of other issues too as well. Welcome back, Charles. How you doing?
And I'm doing absolutely fantastic. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the kind words. And yeah, what an amazing week this was. I genuinely had no idea how these elections were going to go. If it had been a red wave, a blue wave, right down the middle, nothing could have truly surprised me because polls have become so wacky. But I am pleasantly surprised. I'm actually out of Michigan, so Michigan had an unbelievable election when it came to labor-friendly candidates. They flipped the House. We flipped the Senate here as well. It's the first time in 40 years that that's happened. The first thing on the agenda is getting rid of right to work, which is super exciting. So I'm walking on clouds, man.
Totally based. Get rid of right to work. If I were president or dictator for the day of the United States, one of the 10 things I would do is make right to work unconstitutional in all 50 states. I would re-implement or I would implement in a nuanced form Franklin Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights, and I would make collective bargaining a constitutional right. So there you go.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. When you look at the right to work states, I mean, like the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? The five poorest states are all right to work. There's a reason why they are. It's because it doesn't work, and it's built to suppress workers, take power away from them, give it to these corporations, and it has horrible roots as well. You're the one who turned me on to Vance Muse and the racist origins of right to work and anti-Semite. So when you start learning about those things, it's even dirtier than you think it is.
Yes, yes, and then also reared its ugly head again, and I talk about it in my Turning the Page book, I believe. I talk about how right to work resurfaced again in the early 1960s with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other globalist big business organizations that were pushing that. And you had that was also when the National Right to Work Committee also was established. And it started to really gain steam with the Tea Party globalist wave of 2010. Now, why do I say globalist? Because many of the Tea Party Republicans were advocates of free trade and free market ideology. And when you look at Milton Friedman, you look at Ludwig von Mises, when you review their writings, they are globalists. They hate the concept of the nation state and national economic policies that are crafted for the national interest, as well as also for enhancing national security. So I oppose a right to work really also from what is considered a traditional conservative right-wing tendency, which would be viewed as what is the quote, goals of conservatism: strong national security, a strong national economy, including national industrial base and entrepreneurialism, as well as also strong families. And right to work breaks apart families. In fact, there have been studies and articles which have showed that the proliferation of labor unions actually encouraged the single breadwinner wages. You had single breadwinner wages proliferate in this country when private sector unionization was at its highest, about 35% in the 1950s. So that encourages strong families. And there are some dissident and non-establishment conservatives that have written about it as far back as the 1970s, at least. And I talk about that in my book, Turning the Page. my evolution from conservatism to radical civic nationalism. And I really highly recommend people purchase that book. It really kind of turns history on its head. And it's neither considered far left and not sort of Tea Party, Reagan, globalist right. So, but anyways, putting that aside, what do you think the chances in the state of Michigan of pushback now that both houses in Michigan and the governorship are Democratic? How good of a chance do you think that there is going to be a sort of counter reaction that'll be successful?
So, Nevin, I'm almost more scared now than I was before because, yeah, unfortunately, if you get a lot of Democrats in a room, they'll have just a multitude of different ideas of how to accomplish the same goals. And sometimes we argue amongst ourselves more than we do amongst those of the other, political persuasions. I'm confident. I'm worried though, because I know all labor unions out there have different things that are important to them. Being with CWA, broadband, extremely important to us. Call center legislation, extremely important to us. But the builders don't care about that. UAW doesn't necessarily care about that. So I'm worried that we're going to have just a glut of stuff that comes in, and we're going to have a paralysis through analysis, and people are going to be talking about stuff forever. And we have a very short window, a finite amount of time to really pass as much stuff as we possibly can, because if history teaches us anything, it's when you get those majorities in both areas, the pendulum tends to swing. We usually find a level of, stasis between the two groups. So my guess is it's going to swing back the other way. So we got to act now.
Exactly. And I think, and what message will organized labor provide both houses, both the state Senate, state house in Michigan, as well as the governor? What unified message are you and other representatives of organized labor going to send to them to overcome the disunity that might occur in labor's ranks? Because it's like a now or never situation right now. It's like what happened with President Barack Obama from 2009 until November 2010, where he could have done, and he campaigned on to some degree, being the next FDR to reverse crony deregulation, fixing bad trade agreements, and other bad effects of trickle-down economics. But in reality, he didn't do that. In fact, Obama went back on issues related to healthcare, Wall Street reform, etc. And I guess, in my opinion, y'all have to be prepared for that, and really going to have to push really hard and throw your weight through good argumentation, if pressure need be, that labor is where it's at, essentially. And just so many positive multiplier effects about when you have more of an equitable relationship between labor and management.
Great points, right? And definitely speaking to Obama as well. When he took the presidency, they had the House, they had the Senate, and they focused on healthcare. They bought Obamacare through, but they had the Employee Free Choice Act that was out there. That was the PRO Act version 1 right there. And if we had passed that, it could have really changed things for labor. And they didn't, and they missed it. So I've already talked to some other unions about these specific things. And we said, hey, we all got these different, irons in the fire that we want personally to get done for our group. But when it comes to right to work, that's something that we all agree on. So we have to be on the same page, hammering them. And we've got some calls set up for the Michigan AFL-CIO with different labor unions to come together to express that the time is now, that we have to get right to work overturned immediately.
Exactly. It is a critical existential issue. It's a freedom issue as far as I'm concerned. Now, moving forward, you said you're based in Michigan. I thought you were in Ohio.
Nope, I'm out of Michigan. I am part of CDBA District 4, though, which includes Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So it's part of one of our 5 states.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. Alrighty. So Ohio. I like Tim Ryan. Tim Ryan, for those of you who don't know, had a background working in the office of James Traficant, who was a kind of unorthodox Democrat back in the 1980s and 1990s. Some controversial positions that I don't agree with, this program doesn't agree with, but other things like on labor and trade, Traficant was very solid on. And Tim Ryan is kind of an old school pro-labor Democrat, and I was disappointed he lost. J.D. Vance on the surface had some good points that he made, but the reality, like about China, like about trade. But I got to tell you, Charles, I don't trust a lot of the Republicans. Most of the Republicans that pose as populists, in reality, they're fake populists. I think Donald Trump has proved that, unfortunately, and I was a Trump supporter back in 2015, 2016, and a very vocal one. One of the issues that unfortunately faced Tim Ryan is he did not have the National Democratic Party fully behind him, while J.D. Vance had the National Republican machine behind him, Peter Thiel of PayPal, as well as Senator Mitch McConnell's money machine, dumped cash. But Tim Ryan really, from what I understand, was outgunned in that respect. And unfortunately, money does play a huge role in affecting American politics. And that's a different story that perhaps maybe we can discuss at some point on this show or a future show. Now, you're in the upper Midwest. You border Ohio. Your responsibilities with the CWA covers part of Ohio. What went wrong and what went right with the Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance campaigns? Let's break it down.
What a great question. And we're probably too close to know because I haven't seen the demographics on what happened with Tim Ryan. I do agree with you that I think he's a fantastic candidate. He's something of an old school populist, and he talks in a lot of terms that I really respect. He talks about prioritizing American workers, putting American workers first. That's stuff that he's very front and center with, where other groups and people will sometimes shy away from that because it can come off as xenophobic, but it's not. There's nothing wrong with saying that you're prioritizing American workers. It doesn't mean that you're diminishing workers somewhere else. You're just saying that these are the ones that are more important to me. If he says that workers in Ohio are more important to him than workers in Michigan, well, yeah, that's your job, right? So if you say workers in the United States are more important to us than workers somewhere else, well, yeah, that's your job, a home team kind of thing. As far as what went wrong with him, I don't know if in Ohio you can have two senators that are Democrats right now. Sherrod Brown's kind of a unicorn. I mean, that guy's been around forever, and he is also just an old school labor-friendly candidate. I mean, that guy's just rock solid. So I think Tim Ryan was definitely trying to ice skate uphill on this thing. I don't know if he told the party to stay out of Ohio, if maybe he thought that having more progressive people in there would be counterproductive to him getting his message to those people. I really don't know. I have friends that have been involved with his campaign, and I haven't got a chance to really unpack it because lately this whole week, Nevin, I've just been celebrating Michigan's success. So
I think he seemed, I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember him interviewed during the latter stages of his campaign, and Tim Ryan, that is, and he did confirm he didn't have national Democratic money really to speak of behind him. And he seemed kind of annoyed and pissed off about that, too. I mean, obviously, there has to be a further post-mortem on that. But Tim Ryan really represents a kind of Democrat that frankly could also win in Florida. Now, on social issues, I have my own unique views on social issues and hot button issues on abortion and stuff. Some of those views do not conform to the conventional left-right paradigm. But I think to speak about Florida, which is one of the states where the Democrats were routed, and the different progressives are correct, like Nicole Sandler, who's a left progressive talk show host down here. And I agree with her. The Florida Democratic Party down here is in complete disarray. They really are not competent. They tend to be very corporate Democrats. I mean, for goodness sakes, they ran Charlie Crist, who was a former Jeb Bush type Republican governor, who left the party and over some solid policy breaks regarding education. But, I think, and this is where Fetterman did well too, if you really zero in on how are you going to put more food on my table? How are you going to make an environment financially feasible to have another child or a child? How is it going to make it financially feasible for me to move out of my parents' basement, even though I'm working one or two jobs, 40 to 60 hours a week with little free time and whatnot? Those kinds of things. You see, Kyle Kulinski said it best. he said Democrats need to show how progressive policies can actually fulfill conservative goals. And that, my friend, is how you, in my opinion, how you can potentially turn conservative districts. You have to use the arguments and the BS espoused by the corporate right against them. Let's say they call you a bunch of commies, and even people like Donald Trump has said, oh, the Democrats are communists. And we could debate communist infiltration of the Democratic Party, leave that aside. But the fact of the matter is the Republicans are very blemished on this. And I'm not saying for you to agree with this. This is a very controversial viewpoint. In my opinion, it could be potentially winning and peeling off some definitely right-leaning independents and some conservatives, because it peeled me away from being a Republican, at least voting for Republicans. And that is by red baiting the Tea Party right. Oh, Rand Paul is for free trade and more trade with China and Cuba and Russia. Oh, Ron Johnson, his company did business, Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, his companies that he inherited, from, I think, his wife's family. Oh, he did business with China and profiteers from doing business with the CCP, if you will, or Justin Amash, who was found out to have investments with communist Chinese tool companies, or Matt Bevin, the Tea Party austerity nut job, former governor in Kentucky. Oh, he met with the Cuban ambassador because he wants trade with that socialist hellhole. And I believe, Charles, and you don't have to comment if you don't want to, it's a very controversial point of view. The way to tear down the corporate right is you show their hypocrisy. And once you show their hypocrisy, their bleeding against socialism and communism is hollow. When you get down to it, brother, it's all about them with money. Remember the Tax Cut and Jobs Act 2017. Lindsey Graham was totally tripping, saying we got to get this done because otherwise my donors are going to not support us anymore and the Republican Party is going to collapse. You remember that, brother. That's revealing. You hammer that shit home. You hammer it home. You show how they are not fulfilling conservatism's goals. So if you want to give your thoughts about how the Democrats can appeal in red districts, those are some of my views. You can choose to comment on what I'm saying. You can disagree if you want. But that's my take. What is your take on how the Dems can do better in deep red states like Florida?
For one, they got to call people out on their shit, just like you were talking about, right? With the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, talking about the corporate tax rates going from 35 to 21%. And all these corporations came out and said, we're going to pay people more. This is going to be so great for American workers. And then what did they do? They bought back their own stock. They continued to offshore the work. The CEOs got big bundle of paychecks. There was nothing that helped actual workers. So you have to show that, look, we did this for them. The response was this. They've been selling this trickle-down economic bullshit since Reagan told you that the government was your mortal enemy, right? It's 50 plus years. It's never coming down. It's only getting worse. So I think you talked about John Fetterman, who I love, and I think that he did a great job of just talking to people like they were normal people. He's not pretentious. He's not erudite. What you see is what you get. He's a big, tall dude with tattoos that's from Pennsylvania that says we need to make more shit in America. Members of Congress shouldn't be trading stocks. We shouldn't be offshore in federal contracts. Just really populist messages, right? Common sense stuff that appeals to both groups. And he probably won because he went to the rural areas. And yeah, he didn't turn them blue, but he picked up votes in those areas by just speaking to people. And I think Tim Ryan is probably a more polished John Fetterman, and it probably worked against him.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. And I would love to see a political system that's open. And the way we have to do it is, of course, well, I've been struggling with this, but I mean, I do agree we need to overturned Citizens United, McCutcheon, Buckley versus Vallejo, and Bellotti versus the First Boston Bank of Boston. And I'm going to say another thing controversial, and you better saddle up and strap up here, brother, because what I'm going to say is probably going to offend well, part of your audience is probably going to agree with me. The lefties, the hard lefties, are going to agree with me probably on this. But I think the Democrats, they need to start, once they get supermajorities, the progressive populists, and if you get friendly conservative and right-wing populists that are actually focused on not BS cultural issues, but actual economic and national security policy, I would love them to get together. And if the Supreme Court get together to pass laws that say, including constitutional amendments that will say money in speech is not, money in politics is not free speech, at least copious amounts of money is not free speech, lifetime ban on all lobbying for all public officials, from the janitor all the way to a former president, former senator, former congressman, former cabinet secretary, former governor, former military officers too. Huge problem when military generals, they join the boards of major defense contractors. All that will become illegal once they leave office, once they are retired. Secondly, a total ban on all foreign lobbying. No American should work for any foreign country, company, etc. Have their own citizens come here, represent their businesses. If a company in Israel wants to come here and do their thing, let them bring their citizens or something, or have them, people, if they want to, if let's say the Israeli government wants to lobby for a new trade agreement, let their trade representatives represent their country, not Americans or China or anything like that. So a ban on Americans lobbying for foreign companies and foreign countries. That's probably the best way I could put it. Thirdly, we need to take a look at public financing of elections, shorten the campaign cycles, and provide full access to candidates too as well for debates, like maybe 2 debates, have like a year, 6 months campaign length, and that's it. And what else? Probably, I think that's a good start right now for elections. And I would also ban electronic voting machines too as well. All paper ballots. That's another thing I would implement too as well. And if the Supreme Court, the equivalent of the old Lochner Court, which is what we have now basically under Chief Justice John Roberts, and if they say no and hem and haw and declare it unconstitutional, well, this country is going to die, and democracy and the republic, the constitutional republic, is going to die because of the plutocratic-minded court. So what I would do, and this has precedence in American history, and I know a lot of my audience who are the Nyquist fans on the right, they're not going to like what I say, but it is about national survival, and we have to take tough measures, sometimes like a stern father, and take tough measures in order for this country to survive. And what Andrew Jackson said one time after a ruling by Chief Justice Marshall, he said, okay, Chief Justice Marshall, yeah, he made a decision to declare it unconstitutional. I'd like to see him enforce it. And that's what we need to do. We need to have balls of steel and really sometimes go against what I feel are captured institutions that are captured by special interests that seek to override the will of the people when the policies favored by the will of the people make sense and work either in our country's past or in other countries too as well. And that's what needs to happen. And this is one of the things I'm working on in my own radical civic nationalism, is a new political paradigm, because the system is broken. It is malfunctioning. We still have, yes, a lot of liberties where we can criticize our government and not be executed or taken to jail. But are our desires being translated into government policy on all levels? And the answer is no. So my question moving forward, I wanted to make that point about the money in politics and my views on the Supreme Court, because it's not checks and balances being exercised. It's actually our constitutionally mandated institutions that have been captured and controlled by ideologically or profit-driven interests to the detriment of the country as a whole. And that's where government, executive, central, and congressional power can push back and say no, like a father saying to a child asking for a third lollipop, no, you're not having it. Shut up and sit down. I love you and I treasure you, but sit down, be quiet, deal with it. And again, it's a very controversial opinion that I have, but look, I'm concerned about the country's future for my daughter, her children, if she decides to have them, et cetera, et cetera. So moving forward, in your opinion, why did John Fetterman win compared to Dr. Oz? What did Dr. Oz do right? And what did he do wrong? And tell us more about John Fetterman too. Aside from the fact you brought up an excellent point, he talks like a regular guy. He connected with them on economic issues. Can't accuse him of being a racist because he's married to a Latina woman, so that's a good optic right there of an interracial marriage. So you can't tar that, oh, he's just trying to placate a bunch of white working class redneck racist kind of thing. So what did Dr. Oz do wrong? What are some other things that Fetterman did right?
So what Dr. Oz did right is he had a shitload of money. That was number one. What he did wrong is he's a New Jersey guy that tried to come into Pennsylvania and show up at tailgates drinking a red wine saying, I am one of you, right? And what Fetterman did great is he called him on that shit. They put out so much stuff about, buying billboards where, Oz is going back to New Jersey, back to his home state right there. They called him one of the Jersey boys. They did all kinds of memes. They really attacked him in vicious ways. Some of it I thought, oh man, you usually don't see Democrats getting this nasty about stuff. But yeah, I mean, they brought up stuff about the puppies that he had killed with his medical facility over there. I mean, they really went all out on him. As far as what Fetterman did right, I think it was just his messaging. I mean, I'm playing the same hits again, but the way that he talks, the way he speaks to people, he's very blunt. If you look at his Twitter feed, he'll straight up say, we need to make more shit in America. Just things like that, I think, resonate with people. I've once heard that when you meet someone for the first time, if they curse the first time they meet you, you should trust them more because they're more honest, because they're not trying to hide who they actually are, right? We all curse. It's just some of us do a better job of hiding it.
So yeah, so you're not bullshitting me when you say that, and you're not bullshitting the audience, right?
No, yeah, of course. And
I'm trying to chip you up and joke with you there.
But like you talked about earlier, right? If you were king for a day, what would you do? And to jump back, what you talked about, if I had that opportunity, getting money out of politics, we need a constitutional amendment for that, just like you said, right? Because it poisons democracy. Billionaires in this midterm cycle put over $880 million into these elections. And what for? It's not to better the country. It's not to make life better for, people in Florida or people in Michigan. It's so they can continue to not pay their fair share in taxes. So that's one. And then the second thing that I would definitely do is we need a constitutional amendment to get rid of gerrymandering, because I cannot think of anything more fundamentally destructive to democracy than saying that the representatives get to choose their voters as opposed to the voters getting to choose their representatives. And I think Florida and Ohio have something very similar in common, and they've been gerrymandered to shit. Ohio, it's so difficult to win there because they're so gerrymandered, and they had a ballot initiative that said you have to redraw these lines and get rid of the gerrymandering. And the Republicans were in charge of the state Senate and the House over there, and they just kept sending back these gerrymandered states, and the Supreme Court kept saying to them, because they had liberals over there, they kept saying to them, no, these aren't good enough, but they just waited them out. And now they flipped the Supreme Court, so it's almost impossible to win an election. And the reason we flipped Michigan, the stone cold reason that we flipped them, is because we had a ballot initiative that redrew the lines, that made them fair. Because in a state where it's close to 50-50 every single time, but for some reason a certain political party wins 60-70% of the seats, it's because they're cheating. And if you have to cheat to win, well, fuck you.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where we have to stand up to really reactionary institutions that are captured by globalist and reactionary not labor, excuse me, business interests. And it's controversial. I mean, I know I sound like a bit like Huey Long too as well, but I mean, Louisiana was very backwards, and until he became governor and took strong authoritarian measures. And I'm not saying I like governments like that, but sometimes, in when you're in a situation, an emergency situation where your country is being lost, you have to take triage measures to really save it. You have to take some tough and stern measures. And this is what's going to have to happen in my estimation. And I will be writing about that in some of my Substack essays. It's a hard pill to swallow. I know uh, there are a lot in my audience that like to listen to Jared Nyquist, who's an excellent geopolitical analyst. But when it comes to economics, they are well to the right of us on many issues, and they're not going to like that I said this. But I never advertise myself as a Reagan conservative, as a so-called quote constitutionalist, which these days, for the past decade, or since the Tea Party and even before, constitutionalism is used as a buzzword to prevent any sensible populist and nationalist reforms being taken into effect. Franklin Roosevelt talked about it in his speech on economic royalists. If you remember, he addressed that issue of these guys wrapping themselves up in the Constitution to prevent any relief to the American people, which, by the way, guys, staved off a fascist or communist revolution. Two ideologies very much opposed to capitalism, I might add. So, yeah, moving forward, how do you think, I may have asked this before, but how do you think we can get flip red districts blue? And I'm not talking about any old blue like Charlie Crist or Debbie Wasserman Schultz. I'm talking about real populists like a Sherrod Brown or Tim Ryan's down in Florida, Mississippi, Arkansas, for example. Have you guys
We
ever discussed that? What are your thoughts?
we do we have to show them results, right? Talk is cheap. We have to show people results. We have to show how it actually betters you. In this country, it's become a corporatocracy, right? Corporations now run this country. So we need to break them up. There's a reason why all these mom and pop shops, but that used to be, those were working class people, right? They've all been shut down because the Walmarts and all these places have come in and they can lower the prices in a certain area, put these places out of business. And then once they're gone, they can jack up the prices, which is exactly why we have the inflation that we have right now. 54 cents of every dollar of inflation has gone to corporate profits. They're profiteering off of a pandemic, and it's wrong. And the reason that they can do it is because there's no competition. We should be giving federal contracts because there's nothing in this world more powerful than the United States federal government. We should be giving corporate contracts to federal contracts to these companies, to startup companies, so that they can start producing things that we actually need, building it here in the United States, because they can compete with the Amazons and the Facebooks and the Walmarts and the Myers and all these giant corporations if you actually give them the ability to get rid of territorial taxes, stop letting them offshore this stuff, stop letting your profits that are made overseas be taxed a certain way, stop letting them put your profits through Ireland to launder the money. If you fix all of those things right there, average American companies can compete with these giant mega corporations. They can, because these mega corporations are taking the majority of their money and they're giving it to their shareholders, they're buying back stocks, they're giving it to executives, and it's creating this mass income inequality. And there's a popping point on this. So if we actually would fix some of that stuff so that they could have businesses and we could start them up, we don't want to be a service company in the United States where everyone's working as a waiter somewhere. No, we should be building stuff here in the United States because we used to build stuff, and that's how this country was great.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's how we also won World War II. And God forbid if we have to fight World War III, Russia is a threat, even though they're suffering losses in the battlefield in Ukraine. They still have resources at their disposal to damage Western Europe or the United States if they wanted to. China, forget about it. One of the things I liked about that, it was very revealing, by the way, speaking of China, getting back to the election, that I noticed in the debate between Dr. Oz and Fetterman, when when they were asked what is America's chief foreign enemy threat, and of course Fetterman said without hesitation, if you notice, China, red communist China. Oz was very interesting. Now Oz supposedly was criticizing China heavily on the campaign trail, But when he was asked point blankly, what is America's chief foreign enemy? He then avoided the question. If you remember Mr. Charles Daniels, he said, oh, it was Joe Biden's weak policies. And then he went into, oh, we need to, and Biden is not supporting our allies, and we got to support Israel, and we got to, against Iran. And he didn't answer the question. He deflected. Did you notice that, Mr. Charles?
Yeah, ask me why I did that. Because
Why
he
did
makes
he
a
do that?
he gets a shitload of money from China, because China gives him a ton of money, because they make all kinds of things in China. I got a buddy who goes to China for his job. And when he was over there during the 2016 election cycle, he sent me back a picture of Make America Great stickers being made in China. How absurd is that?
And didn't JD Vance have like a relationship with China too as well before he started to get more critical about it?
If they don't, they have a relationship to someone who does. And it's a problem that it becomes so sticky. You cannot, where one begins and the other starts, you can't even tell the difference between them. It's like the end of Animal Farm, where you can't separate the humans from the pigs.
It's a good analogy. I like that. Yeah. No pun intended on the pigs, the private sector oligarch pigs and the communist Politburo of the CCP pigs. Oh boy,
100%.
oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy. So I noticed that and I immediately thought, okay, red flag, no pun intended. Dr. Oz is not a real anti-communist because, he does business with the Chinese essentially, directly, indirectly, whatever. He knows it, so he can't say China is an enemy, Russia is an enemy. If the United States was not a corporatocracy, you would have more candidates that would have the freedom to say, like I would say very unequivocally, I would say China and Russia. They have the capabilities on paper to destroy us and their allies, particularly in Latin America, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and others potentially going to fall, represent a threat to the United States. But the foreign enemies, China and Russia. And I would say that the Cold War never died. And that's why I would say that. And I want to read you something, if you don't mind. And it's very revelatory for the audience. And this is by the analyst J.R. Nyquist, who's really good. He's one of the best out there on foreign policy, national security policy. I've learned a lot from him regarding the fact that the Cold War never ended, that the Soviets repositioned their assets and relabeled themselves, and that you still have the threat of China. So I want to read this to you. This is going to be in one of my newsletter articles that are coming up. It takes time for me to do these things, but oh well. I want to read this, and I want the audience and you to listen really carefully, because this shows really how a form of evil that the private sector oligarchs represent. And I'm not talking about the mom and pop businesses, the big businesses that are rooted in this country. I'm not talking about those people, by and large. And this is in an April 2020 interview with analyst J.R. Nyquist. And he recalled this about his employment with the publication Newsmax. He used to write for them back in the late 1990s. I leave Newsmax because Chris Ruddy has decided that he doesn't want to promote what I am talking about, which is a threat about Russia and China and how they want to potentially take down the United States. And in fact, his financial backers want me to stop because I have this meeting with the main political advisor to a billionaire who tells me, you have to stop promoting this book, Origins of the Fourth World War, which outlines the threat of Russia and China, that the Cold War never ended. So this political advisor to a billionaire tells J.R. Nyquist, you have to stop promoting this book and you have to stop doing this because the financial and industrial elite will never understand this. And the only way we can defend America against its adversaries. He says, I know you're right. I'm fishing buddies with Ladislav Bittman, who has worked as the assistant chief of the Czechoslovakian intelligence disinformation department, and he defected back in 1968. He says he knows the collapse of the USSR was fake. I know the collapse is fake, but we can't convince them, mean the billionaires, anybody, because the financial elite wants to invest in Russia and China, and they want to go everywhere. And the only way we can defend this country is we got to get ballistic missile defense, and then we're going to be good. Well, Charles, we don't really have meaningful ballistic missile defense. We don't have civil defense and haven't had this civil defense in this country for decades. But what's very significant, Mr. Charles Daniels of American Workers First, this is what things like that I've read to you, documentation like that, that's what's, I don't want to say I'm anti-capitalist, but that's what has turned me so against the right in such a militant and a virulent and even sometimes vituperative tone. When you read that and when you love this country, these people are evil. That is evil because they know there is a threat. They know there is a mortal threat to this country, to our families, whether you're in Ohio, Michigan, or Florida. And they know what they're doing is wrong and harmful for the country, but they want to make money regardless. Brother Charles, that is called sociopathy. There's studies done by this. Look it up, corporate sociopathy. This is why I have come to the conclusion we need to take as a federal government a very hard line, and they're going to squeal and they're going to cry, oh, you're being a fascist dictator, a communist dictator, or whatever. And this is why we got to hit back mercilessly for information. This is why I write these things. This is why I have programs like this, because I want to beat this until that horse is dead. And I like horses and animals normally, so I'm using this as an analogy. Mr. Charles Daniels, have any, I want your opinion on that quote, and have you heard stories like this where people have tried to warn the plutocrats of the very threats to freedom and capitalism, but yet they don't give a flipping fuck. They just want to make their money. Unwrap this, Charles. Does this make you sick listening to that?
Oh, it infuriates me, and I online all the time I get called a communist. Sometimes I get called a Nazi. It's very hit or miss what I get called, but all the time, like I said, that I hate corporations, that I hate businesses, I hate capitalism, and no, I have no problem with that whatsoever. I have no problem with rich people. That's fine. I have a problem with us, with everyday Americans, allowing ourselves to be exploited by these corporations. That's what I have a problem with. That's who I'm angry at. I'm angry at us for letting it be this bad, because ultimately we're of the people, by the people, and for the people. And it's our responsibility. The government is a mirror shining back at us, and we've been lazy. And it's time to take things back. And I'll tell you, when the pandemic hit, I think it sped all these things up. And when you're looking at stuff like the CHIPS Act and making more of our medical products here in the United States, it has to do with the fact that these supply side shortages showed us, oh shit, this is a national security issue. So yes, these corporations have sold us out. They are a fish in a fishbowl that no matter how much food you pour in, they will continue to eat it until they explode. They have no ability to stop. And that's fine because it's their nature. But as soon as you define what something's nature is, you can work with it, right? I can be out in the wild and see a rattlesnake and deal with it. The problem is when I'm trying to be friends with that rattlesnake, because I can have a pet rattlesnake all I want, but it's never going to like me. That's what pisses me off. All these people that act like if they just buddy up with these billionaires and defend them online, that in some way it's going to get back to them. No, they're never. You might think that you're on their team, but they know that they're not on your team.
Exactly. No, and I think that you make some really good points. I think this is the reason why we need a firm firewall and we need to balance the interests of things like national security and big business. On this program, we're not socialists. My solution is not, in any way hostile to the concept of billionaires or millionaires. It's how they make their money. It's how they abuse their power to the detriment of not only our country, but even the planet, if you want to also extend it into other issues, as far as I'm concerned as well. So when I read quotes like this, and when you read anecdotal information, I have a good personal relationship with J.R. Nyquist. He's definitely he's more of an unorthodox member of the right. He's critical of the right when warranted. And I strongly respect him for his analytical abilities on geopolitics. He's also a very staunch Made in America protectionist. He's not much of a free trade person, really, at least how it operates for decades. And I look at it and I say, at the same token, this is why I'm calling for measures like what I talked about in the Supreme Court. Sometimes we need to just really say, fuck you, ignore them. Who and what arm are you going to do? You're going to get out there and rally the people so we can defend these globalist billionaires for having way too much power than what is really needed or warranted. Well, the government, we use our microphone and we will push back and we'll read the documented evidence like I had read before you and the rest of the audience. This is the way you fight, with information, and you simplify it. You get people in your political party, the Republicans or Democrats, that are able to simplify it more than I'm able to. And there you go. And this is how you go after the right. Red bait the right. You got to fight the conservatives, the reactionary, anti-labor, globalist element of the so-called right. You have to fight them with their own weapons. Use their laudable ideas. And I agree with strong families. You're a Democrat. I'm a registered Republican. I switch back and forth with party registrations, by the way. I mean, to the point where I will register as a Democrat to vote in primaries, switch back to a Republican, and then maybe next year, 2024, I'll back to being a Democrat. So, but the point being is I like the ideas, Mr. Charles Daniels, about strong families, mother and father, and all the rest of it. I'm not hostile to that innately. I like the aspects of entrepreneurialism. I think that's great when it's done within certain confines and rules and codes and ethics. I think it's terrific. It has entrepreneurial forms of capitalism, has a great benefits, innumerable in many ways. I like strong national security because it's like a father and mother protecting their family in their home. And a nation, a country, there are brothers and sisters, there are family when it comes down to it. So you need to show the failings of so much of the so-called right and turn all that against them. Oh, so you oppose socialism. You want to cut Social Security and Medicare and call that communism. Well, what about this time when you were trying to spike and say to J.R. Nyquist that you don't want to hear him because, oh, you want to invest in Russia and China, but yet you want to cut Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps and outsource more jobs and bust unions. You know, you're just a fucking hypocrite because all you care about is the money. You care about the money. You don't care about me, and you don't care about my honey. I had a little rap song there for you. So that's what I'm getting at. And I know you have a wide audience, and I wish there is some way, and I frankly, I would say this on Labor Vision, where I know Democrats listen. Personally, I mean, I would say this on that show, because we need to really fight back. I mean, we had some victories on Tuesday, but as far as I'm concerned, it was not enough. We need to get to a position where we have true populists in both parties. Democrats, unfortunately, have a better atmosphere for the development of populism than the Republicans, unfortunately. There were some good Republicans that used to exist. The late Walter Jones, a congressman from North Carolina, was a real positive example of a populist, a real populist and a real authentic conservative Republican. Unfortunately, he passed away. But they're the exception rather than the rule. And I would have no problem saying this on Labor Vision. And I know I'm getting your wheels turning in your head when I'm saying this, because frankly, some of the stuff I've told you, you probably have never heard before from any pro-labor person, any person who's a Democrat, let alone a Republican. So some thoughts about what I said, if you care to comment. And then I wanted to ask you about, your comments about recent polls show, particularly within Democrats, that they're moving far left, that younger voters who really helped us out a lot in this election, the voters under 30, by the way, have helped us out a lot. And in Fetterman, Fetterman got people in their 40s and under voting for him en masse, according to some of the breakdowns that I've heard. Why do you think poll after poll, younger people are embracing socialism, even communism? Marxist and communist groups are slowly growing in size. Democratic Socialists of America, which is an organization I do not support, we're talking 50 to 60,000 people, which for extreme left organizations, that's not bad in size. Why do you think, from your experience, why are younger people embracing the doctrines of what is considered the far left? What is going on, and what are some ways to prevent that, in your opinion?
So they probably grew up in such a different world than we did. They're so much more socially aware than we are because they're global in what they see. They're like when we were, I grew up military, right? So I moved every 2 years. So I did get to see, I lived in Texas, I lived in Ohio, I lived in Maine, I lived in South Korea, I lived in Nebraska, I lived in different places. And because of that, I could see different things. But a lot of folks, they live in their own little city and it's this little mini echo chamber and you never really learn about any cultures outside of your own. But they've grown up seeing the entire world around them and they're exposed to different ideas, at least to a bigger extent than we were, right? So I just think that they're more aware. And I mean, the word liberal to me means open-minded. So when you're exposed to more ideas, it makes you more open-minded. And to go back to what you were talking about with ideas and what do you think about this? The Bible tells me that just as iron sharpens iron, so does one man sharpen another. Ideas sharpen ideas. People sharpen people. It's a good thing. Our diversity is what makes us strong. So I think that they're leaning that way. For one, because I think that they see that they're going to be exploited. They don't want to be some battery for the matrix to just siphon off their wealth as they're growing up. They're going to go to school, pay some exorbitant amount and pay student loans for the next 40 fucking years. It's crazy. So why do I want to be a part of that? So they're voting for their own best interests and God bless them.
Well, and Bernie Sanders has a really good video where he took clips about why the Democrats had a better election results than initially was thought, and particularly with the younger people. And, Ted Cruz, for example, was saying and Laura Ingraham were saying that we have to appeal to the younger voters under 30. But the way to do that is they got to repudiate the politics of Ted Cruz. Because Ted Cruz is an ardent Reaganite. He's an economic libertarian, ideologically, too, as well. He read in his own biographical accounts, he was basically reading Milton Friedman and Ludwig von Mises, two libertarian globalist economists, when he was a very young man. So he intellectually drank that spoiled wine, essentially, and imbibed it. And he was also backed by donors that benefit from our privatized oligarchical economic system that seems to be increasing. So I think if I were to give advice to Republicans, I think they have to repudiate Reaganism. And I was hoping that the Trump phenomenon would do that. But in reality is that now that the Trump-DeSantis civil war is starting to
it's gonna be fun to watch, man.
That's gonna be very fun to watch, and that's coming. That's already starting. So you have that going on. You have some pockets of intellectual centers of conservatism, like the NatCon conference, the National Conservatism Conference. I went to one actually in Orlando in late 2021. And, there is some hope with them. I think these are people that we can talk to in varying degrees. Their videos are available on YouTube. There are some dissident conservatives within the American Conservative Publication. That's the name of it. But there needs to be a more thoroughgoing repudiation of Reaganism. And I think just because there's so much money and people have invested their political and intellectual lives in defending that system, that we're going to have to wait essentially for the younger generation. Now, one thing that is concerning me is the rise of the Groypers, the old so-called alt-right. Now, while they have good critiques of libertarian laissez-faire liberalism and trickle-down economics, they lard it up with fascism and covert and not so covert racialism, including anti-Jewish ideology too as well. And that concerns me, that their solutions, and they are attracting more and more younger people, that their solutions are going to be even worse than the Reaganized plutocracy, because under the system of neo-fascism, you're not going to have business freedom, you're not going to have political freedom, you're not going to have social freedoms, and that's an extreme that I refuse to embrace on this program. But in order for the Republicans to succeed, they need to repudiate Reaganism. There is a rich Republican tradition with Abraham Lincoln that's very pro-labor, if you remember. Labor is the prior to capital, as President Lincoln famously said. You have to get back to their protectionism and the old American school for political economy. What would you recommend the Republicans can do? Can the Republicans, even from what you meet with Republicans in your families, your voters, etc. So what are your thoughts there?
So we're both fathers, right? And you teach your children that if you disagree with someone, if you can't say anything nice, usually the right thing to do is not say anything at all. And you shouldn't be callous and mean. You shouldn't be nasty. You should try to lead with kindness when you do. And the Republican Party has completely lost their way because Donald Trump is a madman. He is a megalomaniac sociopath who is now attacking Republicans that he just doesn't want him to run in 2024. But who's going to run in 2028? Who's going to run in 2032? Right? He doesn't care about that, though, but he only cares about himself, and he has poisoned that party. And I think these young kids growing up, they were raised by parents that told them, you don't call people names, you don't do those kind of things, you don't incite violence, you don't do those kind of things. So when they see it happening directly in front of them, they say this is wrong, and they turn away from it. I don't know why the older generation is so quick to embrace it, but I think these kids, they haven't been indoctrinated yet by it, and they see it as just black and white. It's just wrong to act like that. And number one, the most important thing to me is just be a good person. I don't want to win if I have to be a fucking asshole to win.
Exactly. No, I think that's a big part of it. And that needs to be imbibed into our leadership class too, as well. The idea of the golden rule, to treat others as you would want to be treated. So I think there's a good point. Do you think the Republican Party, though, ideologically, they're going to have to do an ideological makeover in order to attract the young people? Because you're right, the young people are being fucked over left and center by our political and economic system and the job market and the housing market and everything else. What can the Republican Party do? Do you even see any signs locally with Republicans that there is a kind of mea culpa where they're rethinking Reaganomics and stuff like that?
I think what they're doing right now is they're doing three things: voter suppression, and voter suppression. That's pretty much their only gig, right? The only way that we can win is if we gerrymander districts, if we try to restrict the ability to vote. That's how they win. And then just fear too, right? To say that brown people are going to come take your stuff. That's what you need to be afraid of. There's a crisis at the border. There's problems at the border. Of course, there's always issues with immigration, but there's not some kind of existential threat that's happening right now that we somehow are ignoring in some way. It's just the same thing that's happening over and over again, but it's constantly this fear that there are witches amongst us, and if we don't burn them now, the whole town is going to be taken over. That their message is fear. And I mean, Machiavelli will tell you it's better to be loved than feared, but I'll say that when I look back at all my heroes, right, leaders that I respect, the Washingtons, the Lincolns, the Martin Luther Kings, the Gandhis, these are people that they led through people loving them. The fact that people would go out there and lay down in traffic for them, they'd run through a wall for these people because they respected them. Those are the leaders that you remember. No one's looking back fondly on Mussolini.
True enough. Moving forward, what do the Democrats need to do nationally to not only retain the seats that they have, but even gain more in both houses nationally and to keep the presidency? What do you see the Democrats need to do?
stop talking about it and start being about it. Let's actually start passing legislation that helps everyday people. When it comes to American Workers First, we got 6 core things. One, we need to get rid of right for work. We need national call center legislation. We need to stop offshoring federal contracts. We need to abolish Citizens United. We need to undo the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, and we need a livable wage for all Americans. I think if they focused on those 6 things, which they have all talked about, and they have an opportunity to pass them, and I think they could even pass them with bipartisan support. If they would focus on those things, I think they could show real, tangible results. And ultimately, that's what people want from government. Make my life just a little bit easier.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Anything else you'd like to add? Because we're reaching past the hour. Anything else you want to add about your organization, where people can find more information or even do work with your organization, American Workers First?
Yeah, if you just get on Facebook and search for American Workers First, you'll find us right there. It's facebook.com/American Workers First, website americanworkersfirst.org. And then I'm also a co-host on the Labor Vision podcast, which we're going to have you back on real soon. I just got to talk with Jimmy. And if you search for just Labor Vision on Facebook, facebook.com/Labor Vision or laborvision.org, you can find us there.
Yeah, great hosts, great program. I highly recommend Labor Vision. First-rate commentary on the economy and the American situation faced by the American workers of all classes. This has been a great interview. Once again, you're on domestic policy. You're one of my favorites. There's no question about it. I know I said some controversial things, added a lot to the discussion, but hey, I like to think out of the box because I think what both you and I have in common is really the betterment of the United States of America, a stronger America, not only militarily, but also economically and socially. Mr. Charles Daniels, as always, we'll call you Sir Charles. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, brother. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You know, ideas don't scare me, man. Come let us reason together. I love different ideas, and I love getting a chance to talk to you. You always have an interesting take on something, and you're very well thought out on it. So it's just a pleasure to get a chance to talk.
If I ever run for president or senator or congressman, come join me as my press secretary. You're very well spoken. You know how to compress complex issues simply. You're a great leader, and it's a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks, brother.
All righty.